Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Tech Showdown. My name is Kevin, this is my co-host Teddy, and today I have a very exciting video for you guys. It's the AMD RX Vega 64 going up against the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1080. This is the Gigabyte G1 gaming model. So let's jump right into it then and talk about the GPUs you get with these guys. So over on the Vega, you get the 14nm Vega 10 GPU with 4096 stream processors, and on the NVIDIA side, on the 1080, you have the 16nm GP104 Pascal GPU with 2560 CUDA cores. Now clock speed wise, I took the highest clock speed I saw out of both of these graphics cards, and the Vega 64 here went up to 1630 MHz, whereas the GTX 1080 went to 1987 MHz, so a bit of advantage there for the 1080. Now TDP wise, the Vega 64 is coming with a 295 watt TDP, wow. And the GTX 1080 is coming out with a TDP of 180 watts, so quite a bit less there. Now, I talked about power issues I had with this Vega 64 in a previous video, so I'll leave that link in the description down below, and you can go over and have a look at that if you want. Now let's talk about memory then. So this Vega 64 is coming with 8 GB of HBM2 memory at 1890 MHz compared to the 8 GB of GDDR5X at 10,000 MHz for the GTX 1080. So an advantage there, I would say, for the Vega 64, HBM2 is very, very good. Now let's talk about the coolers then. So obviously the Vega 64 here is a reference design. This is basically the only one you can get right now, aside from there's a liquid cooled model, but I couldn't get my hands on that. I've only got this one, and this is the one I think most people would buy anyway. So yeah, just a reference blower style design from AMD, kind of like a giant version of the reference cooler you got on the RX 480. Nothing out of the ordinary here. It has the tachometer on the top and a few other nice features, but overall it's just a standard blower style design, and it is a reference cooler, which is never going to be that good compared to its non-reference counterparts, which we will see come out soon. The GTX 1080 here is the G1 gaming model. Now, before you guys explode and say, well, this isn't fair, you're comparing a non-reference GTX 1080 to a reference Vega 64. Okay, so this is for a few reasons. The first of which is that I cannot get a reference GTX 1080. I just cannot get my hands on a Founders Edition nor any third-party reference model right now. This is the one I had to work with, so that's why I picked it. And also because I doubt very many people in the market right now looking to buy a GTX 1080 would pick a reference model. They're going to pick a non-reference design like this G1 Gaming. So I think it's more typical of what the average consumer is actually going to buy. So I think it's more fair in that sense, rather than comparing it to Founders Edition's GTX 1080s, which I don't think anybody would actually buy right now. They would much rather buy something like the G1 Gaming or the Strix or an MSI or something like that, since they're available. That is obviously not the case with the Vega 64, so that's why I'm using this card. But yeah, the G1 Gaming, nice big cooler here, triple fan design. This always does a good job, and I really like it. So let's jump into the benchmarks then and compare these two GPUs. So this is, like always, a bunch of different tests over a lot of different games, some newer games, some older games, some synthetics. I think it's very fair. Both of them were run with the latest drivers, and of course they'll run at all three major resolutions, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. So let's jump into it and see how these two GPUs compare. back. So there can be no doubting that the GTX 1080 wins. It wins in the vast majority of those games and tests, and it wins by a significant margin in some of them. So yeah, this is a big win here for the GTX 1080, and honestly, I'm not surprised by that. It has the advantage of being a non-reference model, which is good because there's no throttling or anything like that. It just maintains its frequency very nicely, and also the fact that it has very mature drivers by now. The Vega did disappoint me, but I think over time it's definitely going to get better. The drivers right now with this GPU are nothing to write home about. There's a lot of improvement that can be made in terms of drivers. Not only that, this being a reference model and quite a hot running GPU means that this was throttling quite a bit. So I think the performance and the gap between these cards is going to close quite a bit once we see non-reference models of the RX Vega 64 come out, and also once we see the drivers improve and mature over time. So I'll definitely do a re-showdown of these two graphics cards in maybe 3 or 4 months down the road, and we can see how much of that performance gap has closed. Now, performance isn't everything. What about power usage? And this is an interesting one. So to do this, I just use Corsair Link. Obviously works with my HX1000i power supply. And I took the total system draw when I ran the Unigine Valley benchmark. So as you can see, yeah, Vega's pretty crazy, coming in at an astronomical 494 watts of total draw. That is crazy. Remember, I'm running a 6900K at 4.2 gigahertz. You can find the full specs for my rig on my about page. But yeah, very, very high there for the Vega 64, even higher than the Strix 1080 Ti. So not very good in terms of power consumption. It's drawing a lot of power, and that is something you're gonna need to keep in mind. Now let's move on to temperatures then. So for this, once again, I tested in the Unigine Valley benchmark on the Extreme HD preset. And at first glance, you might not think the Vega 64 did that bad, only going up to 77 degrees Celsius. Now that is because it has a temperature limit and a fan limit from the factory. So that limits the fan speed to 44% and also limited the temperature as well. Now with that in mind, it was throttling quite a bit with those limitations on there. So that is something you're going to keep in mind, where the GTX 1080, the G1, wasn't throttling at all. So that is something you're really going to need to keep in mind, and that, again, the non-reference models will fix that, certainly. So that'll be really good to see. Now let's talk about noise, and yeah, as you can imagine, this is pretty noisy. I showed you guys in my previous video when you take all the power, fan and thermal limits off this graphics card, it turns into like a jet engine. But even at the stock speeds, it's getting pretty loud. So this, once again, was done in the Unigine Valley benchmark. I'll show you what the G1 Gaming GTX 1080 sounds like first, and then you can see what the RX Vega 64 reference model sounds like. Yeah, so you guys can see there, big win for the GTX 1080. Even if I was using a Founders Edition GTX 1080, it would be much quieter than the Vega 64 reference model. That thing is so loud, even in stock form, but once you take those limitations off, boy, it is probably one of the loudest graphics cards I have ever tested. Which brings us nicely now into the conclusion, and which of these graphics cards do I recommend? So usually I would talk about pricing, but I can't really do that in this video because the pricing is just all over the place with the Vega 64 right now. So I really can't say where it's going to settle. When I do a re-showdown of these two graphics cards in a few months' time, I'll probably include the pricing then because it should have settled down by that point. But what do I make of these two graphics cards? So performance-wise, right now, big win for the GTX 1080. As I said, with non-reference models and driver improvements, I think that gap will close quite a bit. This GTX 1080 has been out for like a year now, so NVIDIA has had a lot of times to get the drivers right. But yeah, there's a lot of improvement there for the Vega 64. But in the other areas, power, it's going to keep drawing heaps. That'll be the same case with the non-reference model. So power draw wise, the power efficiency wise, is a big win there for the GTX 1080. And I also believe that the Vega 64's temps and noise will still be an issue moving forward with non-reference models, because this is a hot running GPU, that is for sure. So overall, I have to hand it to the GTX 1080. Right now, it's just the better card to buy. There's no two ways about it. It is the better graphics card. But as I said, I will retest this in the future, and hopefully a non-reference model of the RX Vega 64 can maybe dethrone a GTX 1080. But hey, maybe by that time Volta might be out. Now, I thank you all for watching this video. Let me know in the comment section down below, what do you make of these two graphics cards? I want to know what your opinion is. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.